Should the Royals be trying to move Chris Bubic or Alec Marsh for a leadoff bat? We'll dive into it in this edition of Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are tuned into another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I am your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. You also can catch us on wherever you get your podcast. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast, or on Odyssey and YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. If you're a first-time listener and you want to know a little bit more about me and this show, I am based here in Kansas City. I work at Sports Radio 810 WHB, doing some hosting, some co-hosting, and a little bit of producing as well. But when it comes to this podcast, when you click on this link, you know that you're going to be getting 30 straight minutes of Royals baseball. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, as new customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. The GM meetings were underway earlier this week, and for the most part, things remain quiet. As we touched on it a little bit in yesterday's episode, you know, there's some qualifying offers that were accepted, that were rejected. That's kind of the gist of what's going on in free agency right now. Nothing too massive or too giant is happening right now, or jaw-dropping is happening. For the most part, it's just business as usual. But late last night, there is a story that goes out, kind of a recap of the GM meetings, and this was posted by The Athletic. So the Athletic for the MLB, and the authors here, Will Salmon and Katie Wu, that did this story, going over just some of the storylines of this GM meeting, of these GM meetings of this week, kind of focusing on what's been highlighted, focusing on some of the main takeaways in the few days that general managers got to meet and discuss maybe some trades, discuss some moves that might be happening. And the Royals were mentioned in this article, and it was involving two guys that I did not think would be discussed in potential trades. And the two guys that were discussed were Chris Bubic and Alec Marsh. Now, they are mentioned in the article. It doesn't mean that the Royals are close to a trade. It doesn't mean that those trade talks went anywhere. All the article brings up is that the Royals are open to offers involving Chris Bubic and Alec Marsh. And the way that I take that is the Royals say, hey, they're not untouchable. And let's be honest, there's not many players on the Royals that should be deemed untouchable. If you feel like you can get an upgrade somewhere, then you need to hear out an offer. Even last off season, I think the Royals entertained or at least heard an offer from the Miami Marlins involving Vinny Pasquantino and Jesus Luzardo. It's all right to entertain that. If you don't make the trade, then no harm, no foul. But involving Chris Bubic and Alec Marsh into this article, it made me start to think about, you know, what could be a possible return. And if the Royals are looking for a leadoff bat, and in this article, it's specified as they're looking for a better version of Garrett Hampson, a right-handed bat that can play center, can play short, can play second. Now, to me, that still sounds a little bit like Taylor Ward. Taylor Ward plays left field, he plays right field, he plays third base. He can bounce around the infield a little bit, but he's predominantly left field, right field, and third base. It's not far off from what that description is. But in this article, two Cincinnati Reds players are mentioned. They're looking for leadoff help. Jonathan India makes sense, and Spencer Steer, who had a fantastic rookie season, then took a step back in 2024. Those are two options that absolutely would be upgrades at the top of the order for Kansas City. And I'm not sold just yet that Jonathan India could be acquired by the Royals for just Alec Marsh or just for Chris Bubic, because Cincinnati's in a unique position where they're not really rebuilding. but I also don't know if they're quite there. However, you have a good offseason, anybody can have a contention window. I mean, Royals fans should know that first and foremost. That if you spend money, if you're aggressive in free agency, if you're aggressive making trades, you can improve by 30 games. So for Cincinnati, not really being a postseason threat as the way they were in 2023, they took a step back, but they can easily rebuild it and have a team that competes in the National League Central, gets a wild card berth, wins that division. Who knows? So Cincinnati's interesting because are they willing to move on from one of their clubhouse leaders, from their leadoff bat, a guy they just gave a 2-year extension to? I've got my, I've got my pushback to it. I've got my doubts about that. Still, Cincinnati needs pitching. Okay. And I think the Royals could capitalize on that in saying, oh, Jonathan India is a second baseman and really a second baseman only. We've got 2 arms here, 2 arms with multiple years of control. We had the second most quality starts among American League teams, and we're offering up our number 4 starter, our number 5 starter, or we're offering up our setup guy. Maybe throw in a lottery ticket kid to see if you can't bring home Jonathan India. Sometimes there are just more valuable guys in an organization that maybe aren't seen as valuable to the average fan, right? I think when that Lucas Erceg deal happened, Oakland looked at Will Klein, looked at a couple of the arms that were thrown in there as very valuable. Or to maybe the Royals fan, you say they were fine, but I wasn't super high on them. So GMs and scouts, they investigate deals like that. They eat, sleep, breathe everything about this sport. So they know what to look for. So sometimes, you look at somebody like Chris Bubic or Alec Marsh and you say, well, that's a relief pitcher or that's a number 5 starter. Cincinnati or somebody out there could say, oh, I really like what their potential shows. They come to our organization. We can tap into something that maybe they're not seeing. And for the Royals, maybe they're looking at Jonathan India. Maybe they're looking at Spencer Steer. Who really knows in regards to the GM meetings and what may or may not be discussed. However, I think the Royals can ask themselves a very simple question when it comes to listening to offers about Alec Marsh and Chris Bubic. What is a bigger problem right now? Is it the leadoff position, or is it the setup role, or is it the number 5 starter? You have to identify what you would be willing to give up to go out there and get that leadoff bat. If you feel like the setup role is still very important and you don't feel confident that Chris Bubic can be replaced in that bullpen, then I don't think there's any need to trade Chris Bubic. Or if you view Chris Bubic as a number 5 starter, there's no need to trade him. Now, that kind of leads it into Alec Marsh. If Chris Bubic is getting moved to the rotation, or they're bringing back Michael Lorenzen and they're hanging on to Brady Singer, then yeah, I think you need to try to find a way to get value out of a young pitcher that's got years of control. But you also need to be realistic about what you have to offer. If you are going to go the trade route and you are going to get a bat that significantly improves this lineup, you can't hang on to everybody that you love. It takes a good player to get a good player. You're not always going to fleece everybody and get some prospect you know is going to be a bust, and you go out there and get an elite arm or you get an elite bat for the lineup. Very rarely does that happen. But if the Royals answer that question with the leadoff bat is the most important, here's how the dominoes could fall. Okay, Chris Bubic to me is more valuable than Alec Marsh, not because he's a reliever, but because he's got the advanced data. He was the setup guy for a playoff team, and they could try him out as a starter. Let's say it's Cincinnati, just to play along with this hypothetical. Cincinnati could say, let's try him out as a starter. It doesn't work out. We know he can be great in the bullpen. That feels like a really good, valuable piece to us. Well, if you're the Royals, say you bring in Jonathan India, just to play hypotheticals here. Jonathan India comes in. He's got an incredible walk rate. A lot of that advanced data supports him having a good 2025. Yes, he's only a second baseman in the DH, but you can figure out a way around that. I don't think you need to pigeonhole yourself by saying we can't trade for a second baseman because we have Michael Massey. Michael Massey can play a couple different positions maybe, or Jonathan India DHs more than he plays second base. That's something you worry about after you get the player. But let's say you bring in Jonathan India. It doesn't mean you have to force Hunter Harvey into the setup role, or force John Schreiber into the setup role, or force Alec Marsh into a setup role. Who's to say you can't go out there and upgrade the setup role by spending some money? I've been against spending money for the back end of the bullpen, but what if you went out there and got Kirby Yates? What if you went out there and got Tommy Kahnle? I think that you could look at that move and bringing in a leadoff bat and bringing in a bullpen arm that's very reliable, that's done it for an entire year. And as much as I love Chris Bubic, he hasn't done it for an entire year yet. And bullpen guys have a short shelf life. They're never going to be as good as the best out there, it feels like. Every time you think you got something special and you think it's going to go on for 4 to 5 years, they're not all going to be the best of the best. Not everybody's going to be Wade Davis. So for Chris Bubic, I'm not saying you can predict the future, but if you feel like he's going to take a little bit of a step back in 2024 or 25, or you're concerned about the injuries, well, this might be your time to capitalize. If you feel like Chris Bubic is a vital part to your bullpen in 2025, I say hold on to him and see what you could get for Alec Marsh. And if it's not a good return, then I don't think there's any idea that would really spark my interest in making a move. I don't think you just need to give up starting pitching depth to get a guy who's not going to be an impact bat for your lineup. But I did find that article very interesting of what the Royals are looking for, who they're open to trading, and maybe some teams that might be a fit. Cincinnati could absolutely be a fit, but we'll see, what they would be listening to when it comes to Jonathan India or coming to Spencer Steer. All right, we're going to take our first break of the show. When we come back, another guy that was mentioned in that article is not through trade. It's through free agency, and I know he's very popular amongst Royals fans. Do the Royals have a shot at Jurickson Profar? We'll talk about it next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. Want to give a shout out to our first sponsor and our title sponsor in FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And if you're looking at some futures picks here and you want to sprinkle down some money, I don't know if it gets any more obvious than Aaron Judge to win the MVP. So look at the odds there and maybe win just a little bit of money on picking the New York Yankee to win the MVP over Bobby Witt Jr., as much as it pains me to say it. Okay, the second thing we're going to talk about really comes down to free agency. And I teased it a little bit in last night's episode about looking at a potential free agent, somebody that makes sense. And one guy that I think is constantly cycled through of, at least with me, when I look at a guy like Jurickson Profar, I say, it seems likely, he seems affordable, and then I go back down this cycle of, I think he's going to return to San Diego. He might be worth more than what I'm thinking he could be, and maybe he's just not an overall fit. Because we know Jurickson Profar is going to get paid. And Jurickson Profar does have, to me, a little bit of a red flag with going out there and giving him a 3-year deal or a 4-year deal. I think Jurickson Profar would be a great addition to the Royals. But every great addition isn't, just littered with green flags where everything about the move makes sense. And I think in baseball, that's the reality of every move, that when you get somebody in free agency or you get somebody through trade, there is some concern somewhere, right? Even with Lucas Erceg, when the Royals gave up what they gave up, there was prospects involved there. But for Erceg, he hadn't been a reliever that long in his career. I mean, the numbers were great for the most part, but again, he's pitching in meaningless games. You didn't know if it would translate well, and it did. It happens. Hunter Harvey, red flags, green flags, it happens. Royals went after Seth Lugo and Michael Wacha. There's green flags, there's red flags. And with Jurickson Profar, I don't want to be a hypocrite and say that I look at one season and say, yeah, you pay somebody for what they did last year. Because last night I said that I would love to go after somebody who's been consistent for 3 years or 2 to 3 years. That you know that, hey, what I'm paying in this guy is not far off of what he's done the last 3 years. If he's been good the last 3 years, I expect it to be 4 years in a row. You have a guy who was really good in 2024, but not really good in 2023, it makes you feel a little bit worried. But then again, Jurickson Profar was good in 2022, not so good in 2021, pretty good in 2020, not so good in 2019. So if you're playing those odds, it lines up that he's not going to be very good in 2025, but that's more so a joke than anything. You look at the numbers, though. I mean, last year with San Diego, a 134 OPS plus, a 380 OBP, so you absolutely would love that at the top of the order. He hit 24 home runs. That was a career high for him. He drove an 85, another career high for him. He stole 10 bases, so you know he's not that much of a base clogger. He almost had 30 doubles. He played in 158 games. That all feels great for the Royals. And though he was a left fielder for the San Diego Padres, he's played the infield before. He used to be a super utility guy, and he's a switch hitter. So it's not like you look at these drastic platoon splits and it's like Jock Peterson where he crushes righties and then can't really face lefties. To me, Jurickson Profar is a fit. But if Jurickson Profar is wanting 18, 19, 20 million a year, which we'll see how the market falls, I don't know if the Royals go for that. And I do wonder how much of his success was playing for a team that was loaded, that had so much star power around it. I mean, Jurickson Profar can probably be good in a lot of lineups out there, but the Royals need to be able to count on a guy that they're going to invest a lot of money into. We talked about Taylor Ward in yesterday's episode. Taylor Ward I like a lot because of the flexibility, because of the last 3 years, and he's been on a terrible team now for a handful of years. So he's had to be the contributor. He's had to be the producer for a long time in LA. In San Diego, you look at guys that, were ahead of Jurickson Profar in terms of who pitchers feared. They're going to fear somebody like Fernando Tatis. They're going to fear somebody like Jackson Merrill. They're going to fear somebody like Manny Machado. Ha-Sung Kim's another one. Maybe they fear Luis Arias because you can't strike him out and he's always hitting singles. Maybe they have fear when Xander Bogaerts is healthy. Jurickson Profar certainly had the breakout year, and I love the fit. I think that he is a phenomenal player right now. The age isn't too much of a concern to me. 31 years old, 32 years old. It's not really going to make me panic if the Royals give him a 3-year deal, but that might be where I cut it off. And that's also another part of how much do I think Jurickson Profar is going to want. If Jurickson Profar wants a 3-year deal, $45 million, you get him for $15 million a year, I like that deal. There's your leadoff hitter. He could absolutely be a star again with Bobby Witt Jr. hitting behind him and Salvador Perez. I like that idea a lot. But I don't want to be that hypocrite and saying, well, I love this move. He's a better fit than Taylor Ward, because one of my things is I would like to see the consistency over a 2 to 3 year stretch. And I do wonder, you look at Jurickson Profar in 2023, starting off in Colorado and not playing that well and then really finding his groove with San Diego. Feels like everybody finds their groove with San Diego because there's so much star power in that lineup. But, you look at that 111 game sample size when he was with the Rockies, it's bad numbers. I mean, he wasn't great defensively. There were some good parts about his game, but still a negative 1.7 B WAR overall in 2023, a negative 1.3 B WAR. Then he goes to a 3.7 B WAR. However, in 2022, it was a 3 B WAR. It's that year by year, I guess, inconsistency that would worry me. I still think he's a great player, but the Royals will have to ask themselves the question, is he great and he was better this year because of who he was surrounded by? Or is he somebody that no matter where you put him, he's going to be great? Because I do have my reserves about that. On teams that weren't the best, or maybe there wasn't as much star power in the lineup, he didn't hit that well. But with San Diego, he thrived. And that is another part to me in free agency and this cycle I talked about to open up the segment. That's where I get to the part of why would he leave San Diego? San Diego's got the money. I think they'd be willing to pay him. And if he looks at it and says, hey, my last 2 years in San Diego, I've been the best version of myself. Why would I go chance it elsewhere and maybe struggle? And that might be the last contract I get. So I think San Diego still wants to get it done with Jurickson Profar. The Royals can be in the running mainly because I think position-wise, leadoff back coming off a good year, it makes sense. But right now, I still see him going back to San Diego. And why would he not? He's coming off a career year, first-time All-Star, and he's got a lot of guys in that lineup that can make it easier on him when he comes to the plate. We'll take our final break of the show. When we come back, we didn't really talk a lot about Evan Sisk being added to the 40-man roster. I think there's a chance he could have a role in Kansas City in 2025 as early as April. I'll tell you what I mean by that next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. Want to give a shout out to our final sponsor today in Hims. Hims is changing men's healthcare by providing you with access to affordable sexual health treatments from the comfort of your couch. Hims provides access to a range of doctor-trusted ED treatments like chewable hard mints and Viagra and Cialis and their generics for up to 95% cheaper. The process is 100% online, so there's no need for uncomfortable doctor's visits. Just answer a series of questions on their site, and a medical provider will determine the right treatment option. If prescribed, your medication ships directly to you in discreet packaging for free. So start your free online visit today at hims.com/lockedon. That's HIMS.com/lockedon for your personalized ED treatment options. HIMS.com/lockedon. The products mentioned are chewable compound products, which are not approved by or verified for safety or effectiveness by the FDA. Prescriptions require an online consultation with a healthcare provider who will determine if appropriate. Restrictions apply. See website details and important safety information. The subscription is required. Price varies based on the product and subscription plan. So I did really like this move that happened last week involving the Royals relief corps and a guy that I loved what he did in AAA Omaha this past year, and that's Evan Sisk. And honestly, my liking of Evan Sisk began back when the Royals traded Michael A. Taylor to Minnesota and got Evan Sisk and Steven Cruz in return. Now I think there's a chance that both those guys could be valuable to the Royals bullpen this coming season, but in different roles, and I think succeeding in different ways. Steven Cruz really started to rely on a cutter this year, didn't really get his chance, but I think there's something there. When you throw that hard and you can really channel the command and you can harness it, that to me is something you don't want to give up on. That's something you don't just keep stashed away in AAA. With Evan Sisk, he reminds me so much of Tim Hill. And J.J. McCullough said himself when they acquired Evan Sisk that there was Tim Hill to his game. And now Tim Hill kind of had that resurgence after being let go by the White Sox. Yankees pick him up, and he's pitching big innings for the New York Yankees in their quest to the World Series. So Tim Hill now is seen in the different light. I thought he had some good years in San Diego, but for the Yankees, he really started to come around again. He really started to make a name for himself again. So the Royals adding Evan Sisk to the 40-man roster, it doesn't mean that he'll be Tim Hill 2.0. It doesn't mean that he'll make the team out of camp. But I do think he provides them a unique ability that nobody in that bullpen has right now. And I'm not even looking at the numbers in AAA. They were great. I think he was Omaha's pitcher of the year, if I'm not mistaken. The walks are still a concern, but he strikes out a lot of guys in AAA. When you throw 92 to 93 with that sinker and he has the funky arm angle, you're going to get a lot of 4A hitters out or a lot of AAA guys that just aren't going to make it to the big league level. That changes once you get to the bigs. And with Evan Sisk, I love the funky arm angle enough where that can be game-changing at the big league level. When you need to get that one out, and I know that loogies are no longer a big deal in Major League Baseball because of the 3-batter minimum. But if there's a scenario like we saw numerous times this year where Angel Serpa came in, you got a lefty at the plate, it's bases juiced. Evan Sisk would need to, as I said, harness that command a little bit more before I would trust him in a spot like that. But if you're really hitting spots with that arm angle, it makes it really difficult on a lefty at the plate. And I don't think the Royals had enough lefties in the bullpen that really shined against the lefty. I want to have that matchup where it's lefty coming to the plate. It's a no-brainer who you want to go to. And Evan Sisk, not making his big league debut yet, it would take some time to earn that credibility, to earn that trust. But I think there is a path to the big league level. There's going to be regression in the bullpen. There's no and ifs or buts about it. Somebody is going to take a step back. If it's a lefty, right? If it's somebody like Sam Long, he takes a step back. I think he's that first call. I think he is that guy because he would be on the 40-man roster, assuming he stays there, that you say, even if he's in AAA, we're going to get him up to Kansas City. And I would like to see what he does in that bullpen. I would like to see that type of angle coming from the left side. John Schreiber kind of gives you that from the right side, and he had a great slider, a great sinker when located well. If Evan Sisk can give you that from the left side, I like his chances to be an above-average reliever in Kansas City. Right? Relievers kind of pop up out of nowhere. Every single year around baseball, you'll see some guy pop up on a leaderboard that you've never heard of because it just happens that way, whether they be failed starters, whether they be guys that were stashed in AAA for a long time. Evan Sisk, to me, is that if he doesn't make it in Kansas City, he will somewhere else. And he is going to be somebody that catches on somewhere else. Because to me, the last thing he needs to just figure out is that control. He gets that control. When you throw like that, when it's that 3/4 from the left side, and even a little bit closer to the submarine angle, when I think about it now, that can be so dangerous. And that can be such a weapon for the bullpen. And even if there is no big regression from anybody in 2025, when you look at the bullpen, you're not going to stay healthy for the entire year. Guys are going to get banged up. Guys are going to go on the IL. Guys are going to get traded. Guys are going to get DFA'd, and a spot is going to open up. But he's going to have to prove in spring training that he's got that control down, and he can surprise some people. That was one thing that let me down in camp when I was down in surprise this past February, is some of the guys that I wanted to go in and really take a spot, they didn't. Either they weren't healthy or they didn't pitch well enough. Evan Sisk could go into surprise, go into camp, and open up a lot of eyes, and people could take that with some legitimacy to it and say, he might be ready. I mean, he's 27, 28 years old. I think he's too good for AAA, but you need to find out if he's good enough for the big league level. At this point in time, you got to figure it out. You don't want to keep a guy down there who's just dominating in AAA, but you feel like there's no spot for him in your big league bullpen. If there's not, see if there's some value and try to flip him somewhere else. I don't even know if Evan Sisk is going to be on the 40-man roster come February. But this just feels like that Tim Hill move that we saw years ago in 2018 or going into 2018. They made that 40-man roster move for Tim Hill. He hadn't pitched in the bigs yet. He broke camp with the team, and he kind of became that guy they counted on to throw a lot of innings out of the bullpen. And that was a bad team, a bad rotation, but in big spots, if there were two lefties coming up, you wanted Tim Hill out there. And for Evan Sisk, I think there's something there. There's absolutely something to work with, and that excites me. I feel like if you can put it all together with him, that's a weapon to have out of the bullpen. I feel like he's too good to have at AAA at this point. And if there is a spot for this bullpen, it needs to go to him. If there's one spot. And if there's not a spot, he's got to be that sixth man, right? To bring it up in basketball terms, or I guess the ninth man for the bullpen. A spot opens up. I would love to see what he has out of the bullpen in Kansas City. All right, that's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson. Thank you for making Locked On Royals your first listen today. For your second listen, find Locked On MLB as baseball guru Sully brings a daily blend of humor and baseball, keeping you updated on every rumor and story throughout the offseason. Find Locked On MLB on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Tomorrow, going to do a little bit of an article on Anthony Santander and if it makes sense for the Royals to pursue him in free agency. But until then, you take it easy, Kansas City.